I'm Dr. Zoe Landsman. I work at the University of Central Florida in Orlando, Florida, at the Exolith Lab. And today I'm going to talk to you about the work we do there, which is working with essentially fake space dirt. So I'll tell you about why and how fake space dirt is useful in preparing to have a long-term human presence in space. So just a quick bit about my background. So I got my bachelor's in physics in 2011. I was an English major, so I was not a person who always knew I wanted to be a scientist. So that bachelor's degree took a little longer than normal. And then I worked for a while as a computer programmer, and then went back to school to get my Ph.D. And my field of study is planetary science. So that's the scientific field that covers the scientific study of the solar system and other planetary systems. It's a very broad field, so that could be anything from studying moons to planets to atmospheres of planets to comets and asteroids and rings around planets, and even how planetary systems are formed in the first place. My personal scientific motivation in my research is to better understand how our solar system formed and evolved over time by studying the surfaces of asteroids and also the moon. Asteroids in particular are really useful for helping us understand how the solar system formed, because they've been essentially unchanged since the very, very beginning of the solar system. So they're this kind of record of how things were early on. And then I seek to apply this understanding of the solar system to support exploration of the solar system, whether robotic exploration or human exploration. And I go about this a few ways. I go about my science a few ways. So, science can look a lot of different ways. So some of the science I do is observational. So that's using telescopes to observe interesting things in space. Maybe there's an asteroid that has some particular scientific value and we want to understand it better. So I'll look at it with a telescope and get some data on it. I've also done some theoretical science. So that's, using computer code to essentially simulate processes that happen in the physical world and understand them better that way. And I've also done experimental science, which is how I was led to the Exolith Lab. So that's me in the center there. This is a picture from some experiments I did at Johnson Space Center. But I've done some experimental work studying analog materials, so meaning studying materials from Earth that are similar to what we expect to see in other objects in space. So the Exolith Lab, where I work now as the science lead, is part of the Center for Lunar and Asteroid Surface Science, which is at UCF. This is a center supported by NASA through a program they have called SURVEY. So it's a really big group of researchers in planetary science at UCF. So we're part of that. And the goal of the Exolith Lab is to make and develop and provide to the community high fidelity regolith simulants. So what do those words mean? So regolith is the loose dusty layer on the surface of an object like Earth or Mars or the moon or asteroids that sits above bedrock. So on Earth, this is just what we call soil, right? If, in most places on Earth, if you go outside and you look at the ground, it's not just, hard bedrock, right? There's loose soil on top. And that's the same case on the moon. It looks a little different on the moon and on asteroids than it does on Earth, but it's essentially just ground up rocks that make this very fine bed of particles. And simulants are, fake regolith, essentially Earth materials that are standing in for regolith found on the moon, Mars, and asteroids. So that's what we mean by simulants. And then high fidelity means, we try to get these things as close as we can to the real thing in terms of the minerals that are used, the chemistry of those minerals, and the shapes and sizes of the particles at the teeny tiny level. So there's some of our bags of regolith simulant on the shelf. So why am I doing this? Why are we doing this? Well, it's really, really hard and expensive to get actual regolith from the moon or Mars or asteroids, right? You have to send spacecraft there or people. And, of course, we've done this. For example, we have samples from the moon, right? We had, NASA sent many crewed missions to the moon in the Apollo program, and we have samples. But, they're very, very hard to get, and they're very precious, and there's not a lot of them. So there are a lot of reasons you would need to play with regolith or something close to it that, you couldn't justify using those precious samples, or you need a huge amount. So there are a lot of scientific studies where, maybe the study is destructive, right? You're going to destroy the regolith in your study. So simulants are great for that because, they're cheap. So destroy away. We use them in education as well. So through many programs, we have K-12 students who are working with simulants, for example, to grow plants, practice, to see whether plants can grow in simulant. But probably the biggest thing that simulants are used for, just in terms of, who is getting the most simulant from us, are those who are working on developing space technologies. So people, for example, who want to test, maybe they're making a component of a landed spacecraft, like a rover, and they want to test the rover wheels or the joints on that landed spacecraft or a seal or something, and see how well those things hold up against the regolith, or, is the wheel going to turn in the regolith? So you want to test that before you're there. So, you might then want to get a big bed of regolith simulant and test your rover wheel, for example, there. The next point kind of ties in closely to Dr. Temi's talk. So, it's really hard to bring all the stuff that you need to have a long-term human presence in space from Earth, right? Because you have to launch it off the surface of the Earth, and it's heavy. So, we want to use as much stuff as we can that's already there on the moon or Mars, for example. You could build habitats out of regolith, or you could extract oxygen or water from regolith to support human life. And so people use simulants, regolith simulants, to test those technologies. And then this is kind of what the picture that I have here is illustrating, that dust on the moon in particular is a really big problem. The lunar regolith is very, very, it's like a powder. Like if you think of cornstarch or baby powder, it's that kind of a texture, and or even finer, and it just gets dust everywhere. And it was a big problem in the Apollo era, and it's a health problem. So it's not good to inhale it. So preventing damage to equipment and also preventing harms to human health from dust is a big problem for having people on the surface of the moon. And so people want to test systems to deal with that using simulant. So that's the motivation for having simulant. So then how do we make it? Well, we start by having a reference material. So, a regolith is really it's essentially just ground up rocks. It's the stuff that was the rocks that these things are made out of. The moon is essentially a big rock. Asteroids are big rocks. And the surface, it gets ground up by things like, on the moon and asteroids, surface is ground up by impacts of meteorites over billions of years. Mars, there's also other processes. There was probably water in the past, there's wind. So there's several processes on Mars. But anyway, it's just ground up rocks. So we want to know what those rocks are. What are the minerals in those rocks, so that we can match those minerals with Earth rocks. So we pick a reference material. So, for the moon, we have samples that were collected by astronauts. So those make great references. There's lots of notes about where those samples came from, et cetera. Mars, there are a couple of meteorites from Mars. So pieces of Mars that broke off and landed on Earth. But we actually have better data than that, because we have laboratories all over Mars, and those are our Mars rovers. So the rovers have studied various sites on Mars, and that tells us about those minerals. And then asteroids, we have meteorites. Again, those are pieces of asteroids. And now we're starting to get samples collected by spacecraft, and we have data from telescopes as well. So basically, we figure out what are the minerals that are on these objects, and then let's go out there and find some Earth rocks that are close. A couple of considerations, though. Earth processes are very different from these other objects I'm talking about. Earth is very different from the moon or Mars or asteroids. We have abundant flowing water, we have an oxygen atmosphere, we have volcanoes, we have plate tectonics, and those processes change the chemistry of rocks and minerals. And so, you know, we have to be very careful that we're using earth rocks that are as reasonably close as they can be to the thing we're trying to mimic. And we also have to make sure that we can get these rocks consistently in large quantities. So, you know, having one really great rock is not going to be helpful when we want, you know, somebody wants 10,000 kilograms of simulant, right? We need truckloads of really good rocks. So, so that goes into the process. So we find the rocks and then we crush them and turn them into a powder, essentially. So this is just a visual representation of the process. We start with rocks, and I take no credit for this part. We have a simulant team, primarily UCF students, although not entirely. And this is not their only function at Exolith, but one of their very important functions is they take rocks, and there we have a series of rock crushers that crush the rocks finer and finer, and then we use sieves. You could think of it like a strainer to strain out the big pieces, and we end up with, you know, you start with some big rocks, and you end up with this very fine dirt. This is the final thing I'm going to mention, is just, so what do I do at the lab? If I'm not out there with these hardworking folks crushing rocks, what do I do? Well, I do several things. So one important role I have is analyzing rock and mineral composition. So, you know, I was mentioning that, you know, we have to be really careful to make sure that the chemistry of the rocks that we're using is appropriate. So when we need to find a new source for a rock to put in a simulant, I will take that and analyze it using some of these analytical techniques that I've mentioned here: X-ray diffraction and fluorescence spectroscopy. You know, we take them into the lab, you get some charts that look like these squiggly lines here, and those squiggly lines actually tell you a lot about what's happening at the molecular level inside the minerals. So I do a lot of that. I also do a lot of characterizing and evaluating our simulants. You know, we want to know how well do these simulants actually mimic the real regolith, and in what ways don't they? You know, there are no perfect simulants. You know, there's nothing like the real thing. So we want to make sure we know, so that we can, you know, help inform people who want to use our simulants. Yeah, they're really good for this purpose, but maybe not so good for this other purpose. And that leads into something else that's a big part of my role at Exolith, which is to help researchers and engineers incorporate simulants into their projects. You know, make sure they're using the right kind of simulant. You know, making sure it's going to do what they need it to do for their project. And sometimes that involves coming up with a custom simulant. You know, sometimes what we have on the shelf just isn't right for somebody, but we can make we can make a custom one. So we do that. And then one of the best parts of my role at Exolith is getting to work with a number of students at UCF, undergraduate and graduate students. Here's our team. And many of these folks are students, and they're involved in all aspects of Exolith, from, like I said, crushing rocks to research and the business aspect of the lab, you know, working with customers. So, you know, getting to work on research with students and, you know, guiding them on their independent research is one of the most fun parts of my job at Exolith.
One question we have here is, I guess this is probably for Zoe. How does nutrient density work in non-Earth soil types? And I guess how would that impact the nutrients in those plants?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a very good point, right there. Earth soil has nutrients because there are biological processes adding nutrients to the soil. There's plants decaying and animal matter decaying and bacteria that are processing the soil. So, right, so we have nutrients in earth soil because of biology. So how does that work if you're you know, on a lifeless rock? Well, it's a problem. There are very few nutrients available, for example, in the lunar soil. There are some people who are working on studying how well you can grow plants in regolith with nothing added, but generally speaking, you probably have to add some kind of nutrient to the regolith if you want to use that as a medium to grow plants in. And then the question just becomes, what is the best nutrient that you can bring that's not so bulky and heavy, so that it's reasonable to bring, or something that you could make in an ongoing way in space. So
thank you. I'm sure like there's a lot more science to be done on that area. Is it possible to predict the atmosphere on deep space objects? Sort of like, we haven't been there. What do we do with that information? This question particularly asks about constructing simulants.
So you can, if you're talking about, for example, exoplanets, so those are planets that are around other stars, other planetary systems, it is possible to predict what those atmospheres are like. And you can do that. This is actually one of the things that the James Webb Space Telescope is going to be amazing for. So you can do that with telescopes. And what you do is you watch the star, so you know that there's a planetary system around some star, and you point your telescope at the star. And if the planetary system is aligned just right, the planet, from your point of view, will sometimes go in front of the star. You can imagine, if you're looking, don't ever look toward the sun, but if you're looking toward the sun at the right times, there's what we call a transit. So you can see Venus or Mercury from our perspective on Earth, right? You can see Venus or Mercury pass in front of the sun. So we're doing that, but we can do that with a telescope looking far off at other stars. So you watch the planet go in front of the star, and then you see the star dims a little because the planet is blocking a little bit of that light. And when that dimming happens, the light from the star is passing through a little bit of that planet's atmosphere. And depending on what that atmosphere is made of, the atmosphere of the star will dim more or less at certain wavelengths. So you can make a model and figure out what gases are in that atmosphere. So yeah, this is going to be one of the huge things that James Webb, we've been able to, not me personally, but colleagues of mine have been able to do this with other infrared telescopes like the Spitzer Space Telescope, but James Webb is going to be tremendous for this. And I don't see why you couldn't construct, I'm sure somebody has done this. I don't personally do this, but I don't see why you couldn't have a cell in a laboratory where you mix those gases that you've measured, you've modeled that they're in this atmosphere. You could make sort of a box of atmosphere in a lab. You could definitely do that.
Awesome. Thank you. Give me your best estimate to how long it's going to take us to get to Star Trek.
I think it'll be sooner than we can imagine, because technology tends to grow exponentially, so it's we kind of think of it linearly, like, oh, well, in 10 years, it's going to be whatever. It's going to grow at the same rate every year that it's been growing, but technology grows, exponentially. So I think it's going to surprise us how soon it happens.
Awesome. Thank you for those answers. Thank you everyone for joining us.